In the early 80s, GM cars weren't exactly known for their quality, but despite underpowered engines and poor craftsmanship, it still held over 40% of the US market, meaning it had no concerns about selling lemons to anybody, including Saddam Hussein. In 1980, GM inked a deal with Saddam to sell the Iraqi dictator 25,000 cars to use as taxis and government vehicles. 2 years later, the whole thing collapsed amid accusations over shoddy build quality and a looming regional war. But the custom-spec cars he ordered for the desert, well, those went on to become cult icons in Canada, of all places. So what really went down between GM and Saddam? How did GM get around international sanctions to make this happen in the first place? And if these cars were so bad, why were GM employees lining up to buy them later? This is the story of the Chevy Iraqibu. At the time, the Middle East had absolutely no automotive industry, and Iraq was in desperate need of cars to serve as taxis and government vehicles in cities like Baghdad. Even today, it's not really clear who called who first. It's not like GM wants to talk about how it tried to get into bed with a genocidal dictator, but regardless, Saddam, whose love for American cars was well documented, wanted to order 25,000 1981 G-Body Chevy Malibus, which was a potential $100 million deal for GM. But there was a problem. US-Iraqi relations are complicated at the best of times, and in 1980 the US had instituted economic sanctions on the country following Saddam's bloody rise to power. In the first week of his presidency, he had 21 political rivals executed in an event known as the Ba'ath Party Purge. The sanctions meant that no US company was allowed to do business with the Iraqi government. But GM had a plan to get around this, and that was to fulfill the order through GM Canada and ship the cars via the port of Halifax. GM's plant in Ontario had been in operation since 1918, but the Iraqi order would have been one of the largest in the plant's history and a big boon to the Canadian automotive industry. The deal was so impactful that the Canadian government got involved to make sure it went through. They guaranteed GM the sale. So in other words, if anything went south, the Great White North would be on the hook for the money. So, with the international export problems out of the way, the next hurdle was reliability. GM was already being outdone there by the rise of Toyota and Honda in the US, and in Iraq, the arid desert climate would be even more of a challenge. Cooling is a major concern, with summer days in cities like Baghdad regularly topping 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The amount of dust and sand meant that air filters and radiators easily get clogged, and outside of major cities, most roads in Iraq were unpaved. These Malibus needed to be stout and simple. GM opted for the largest cooling package with a 4-core radiator, an upgraded air conditioning system, of course, heavy-duty suspension, rugged tweed and vinyl interior to stand up to constant use, and a simple 3-on-the-floor manual transmission. The cars were also given the smallest engine, a 3.8-liter carbureted V6 making a whopping 110 horsepower. With as few electronics as possible, plenty of cooling capacity, GM sent the first 13,000 Malibus off to Iraq. Unfortunately, the news from Iraq was not good. Saddam's government reported the Malibus were constantly breaking down. The main complaint was that the 3-speed transmission supposedly had issues shifting, which is like the one thing you need a transmission to do. GM scrambled to solve the problem. The issue could have been that the clutch release bearings designed for use in Canada were not acting the same in the hot streets of Baghdad. GM sent nearly 100 technicians to Iraq to make field repairs to the fleet and try to fix the clutch issue. This is the part where the story gets a little complicated. The Iraqi government continued to state that they were unhappy with the build quality of the vehicles, but GM's stance was that all the issues with the car were either fixed on site or had actually met their initial standards. It could be a difference between expectations and reality, or it could be that with the Iran-Iraq war gathering momentum, Iraq was no longer in a financial position to complete the order and use build quality as an excuse to get out of the deal. Either way, the upshot was that GM still had 12,500 desert-spec Chevy Malibus sitting in a lot at the port of Halifax without a buyer.
And finally, 2 weeks ago on The National, we broke a story about thousands of cars General Motors was trying vainly to sell to Iraq. But it seems Iraq still doesn't want those cars.
So the Canadian government had promised that GM would get paid for this order no matter what. So they were just as invested in finding a new buyer for these cars. GM workers insisted, however, that the cars were well made, or at least no worse than anything else it was building back then. And so several of them put up offers to buy units from the stock still in Canada, even though they wouldn't have technically met Canadian emissions standards. But this gave GM and the Canadian government an idea, and the issue of emission standards was suddenly no longer an issue. They shipped the remaining Malibus to dealerships across Canada to be sold as cheap, rugged workhorse models. They were sold for $6,500 Canadian, or the modern equivalent of about $16,000. The Canadian public ate the idea up, and soon GM was getting complaints from dealerships that they wanted more supply. In fact, the GM Workers Union threatened a class action lawsuit as they didn't end up getting a large enough allotment of units to cover the workers that had put down deposits. The Iraqi taxi, or the Iraqibu, became something of an icon in Canada. Many Malaise-era car enthusiasts know the story of how these rugged, desert-bound sedans became the affordable rear-wheel drive runabouts from Nova Scotia. Even though these cars were designed for one of the hottest climates, they became quirky, unique fixtures in one of the coldest. Sure, they didn't have rear window defrosters, but they truly didn't seem to be any less reliable than other G-Body vehicles of the time. Today, the Iraqi taxi Malibus are rare collectibles, especially in stock form. The G-Body platform was a popular choice for hot rodders to swap in a big block V8. With the cars being so freaking cheap, they really weren't seen as something to preserve. Between that and rust, well, you can understand why most people think this was an urban legend, but it really happened. Our other series on the channel, Charisma, is all about the stories that make cars unique. And you know, the amount of story that these Chevy Malibus had before they even rolled off the lot, that makes them worthy of recognition. If you've ever seen one of these Iraqi taxis, or maybe you own one, or maybe you learned how to drive stick in one all those years ago, let us know in the comments. I'll see you back here in 2 weeks with another story. Thanks for watching The Drive.